The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Well, hello, everybody. Unfortunately, my co-host, the lovely and wonderful and intelligent Jen Durrell, can't join us tonight. She's sick again, so you're stuck with my less attractive mug. But thankfully, we have a far more handsome and far more interesting guest than myself on tonight. He's a documentary filmmaker and commercial director from Toronto, Canada, now in Austin, Texas. His all-consuming interests in radical science, cryptozoology, and general esoterica inspire his stories. His professional and independent work has been seen by millions on CNN, Wired, Vice, Cosmopolitan, the LA Times, The Verge, Filmmaker, and IndieWire. His first feature, Love and Saucers, which is absolutely fantastic, toured fests worldwide with a special jury mention at Fantastic Fest 2017 and landing a Hulu exclusive. His recent short, Conspiracy Cruise in 2019, starred Henry Zebrowski and had similar success, and it now lives as a Vimeo staff pick. Though he has not yet had a supernatural experience, he is ready and willing. Well, tonight might just be that night on Talking Weird. Strange things happen on this show. His most recent documentary short, TELOS or Bust, will be screening at the 6th Annual MidWest WeirdFest, where, of course, Jen and I will be. And that takes place this March 4 to 6 at the Micon Downtown Cinema in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. So I'm delighted to welcome to the show tonight Brad Abrams. Normally we have a little segue, but now it's, hey, Brad.
Hello.
It's so good to have you. I'm so excited to chat to you. I've been aware of your films for quite some time. I think it was a documentarian called Dan S. Do you know Dan, who recommended me to you initially?
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
Or I think, yeah. He's what I'm trying to remember. He certainly mentioned you. He mentioned your name to me a couple of years ago, and he must have been at a festival with you. We screened a feature documentary of his Vorking at the very first year of MidWest WeirdFest. So from then on in, we've screened some of his other work, and he was like, "You've got to track down Brad Abrams," I think. And then I was also conscious of your work, but it was so wonderful that that we have you at the. And this is the first time we've announced we have TELOS or Bust at the festival, because the full program doesn't get announced until this coming week.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I've always wanted to experience your festival. I heard about it years ago when I was in Australia, of all places, and a mutual friend of ours had said, "You've got to hook up with Dean when you're back in the U.S."
Well, I'm glad our paths have finally crossed, and we get to have you at MidWest WeirdFest this year. So let's start. We'll go back through some of your other films, but let's start at TELOS or Bust. Can you give the audience a little taste of what that story is about, what that documentary film covers?
Yeah, so it takes place in the idyllic little town of Mount Shasta, California, which is near the border of Oregon, in sort of the center of the state, and it rests at the foothills of the mountain of the same name, Mount Shasta. And what makes this town unique is that a large percentage of the people that live there believe that there is a hidden secret city that's underneath the mountain called Telos. And it's inhabited by these immortal, perfect beings that they call ascended masters. And there's various ways of getting into Telos, they believe, but they're all trying to get in for various reasons. Like, they want to live forever. They want to transcend. They want to be free of sickness or death. And for some people, it's a physical thing. They want to actually find a door to open up and enter in, and other people is more of a metaphysical or spiritual thing. And for me, it's really about this exploration of the folklore, and it's part of a series, doc series that I want to do with the same team. That each episode is a little known, bizarre piece of folklore that we uncover and explore. And so this was like our first foray into that.
Can you give us a hint at what some of the next ones are going to be in the series?
Yeah, we want to do the elves of Iceland and the elf school in Iceland, the yokai of Japan, We want to do one called Support Your Local Monsters, which is about the really, the lesser known monsters, like the hodag in your home state would be one of them. And in Texas, the Lake Worth goat man. We want to do an episode on dowsing, on the spiritualist town in Florida, Casadaga. One about space cults and space visitors, like Unarius and the Aetherius Society. And the list goes on and on, witchcraft, Satanism, all manner of folklore.
It's interesting you mentioned Unarius, because I had a Unarius question for you. I don't have many questions planned for them. I don't plan much. I just see where it goes. But this is something where I thought, other than the fact that you and I are both involved in film in different capacities and have an interest in the weird and the unusual and the esoteric and the fringes of belief, when I was doing my PhD dissertation on UFO belief, I spent some time with the Unarius Academy of Science. I was there in 99 for their, what is it called, the Conclave of Light or something. And originally 99 was the year. For those who don't know, Unarius is a UFO New Age religion which dates back to the 1950s, and they believe in, it's almost like the ascended masters that you're talking about of older theosophical traditions, but the Space Brothers are very advanced, and they were going to come and land here in 99 and stack their sources like 33 on top of each other out in the land that the Unarius organization own outside of El Cajon, California, in the desert there. But when I was there, I was probably the only outsider, although unlike a lot, when people think of UFO cults, they often think, oh, it's all very contained and there's nobody from the outside, because we think of Heaven's Gate and things like that. Unarius wasn't like that. There were other fellow travelers who were welcome there. Like I met Reiki master types and masseuses and other just people who inhabited that kind of new agey, circle, who weren't members of the organization. But the only true outsiders, the only people who were there as observers, were myself and I think it was a film crew from one of the American news shows like 2020 or 48 Hours. I can't even remember. One of those old 90s shows, which was, fairly popular back then. And because I was interested in this, that I was studying academically, the journalist said, I'm going to take you out to dinner. And so they spent a lot of money getting me drunk and spending cash on me, because they just wanted me to be able to tell them the background of all these stories, I guess, so they could fill in their 2020 story or whatever it was a little bit. And I remember one of the most telling moments of that whole research trip was when the journalist said to me later in the night, he said, you and I, we're no different. We both come here. We pretend to be these people's friends. And in the end, you and I are ultimately going to betray them. And I never thought in that capacity that I was betraying them. But I do know when you're welcomed into that kind of situation and you're trusted, you mightn't necessarily have the desire to promote the belief system. You might want to cover it objectively. And do you feel that when you go to these organizations? Do you think, well, I'm kind of being these, or not organizations, individuals even, do you feel like you're being their friends, but when they see what you capture, they might be, oh no, Brad's let me down. He hasn't shown my story the way I wanted it to be shown.
Yeah, this is the whole trick of documentary filmmaking, or journalism. The difference being with docs, and at least the docs I make, is that I don't have a position, whereas like a journal, that 2020 news story is like, look at this, look at how ridiculous it is. I'm not going in with that mindset. There might be some aspects of it I do find ridiculous, but I don't have a belief that I'm trying to transmit. And I on the other side, I'm not making like a promotional piece for these people too, right? So I tell them from the outset, this is neither like, I'm not puffing you up and I'm not taking you down. You might find the final piece just maybe weird, because like I do weird music and sound design and editing and stuff to make it interesting. But I'm not going to make you look ridiculous. I'm not here to laugh at you. Regardless of all that, there's still always someone who, you're going to be sensitive, especially when you're putting your beliefs out there that are very fringe. And so I definitely have had subjects that feel, sensitive about how I've portrayed certain things, but I've never had anyone think that I've tricked them in any way.
No, I think they're very fair, your documentaries. If they're on the other side of you, whether presenting them fairly or not fairly, and I think it's always balanced, I do in the films of yours I've seen. But have you ever been gone into something, perhaps a little, just in the center, but in the end you've walked away and gone, I really think there's something there. Like there's something weirder.
Yeah, a little. Actually, surprisingly, it was my first independent short doc was about the skunk ape of Florida, which is basically like the Bigfoot of the Everglades. And I went in there without any belief that this thing was real. I was like, that's kind of like I'm definitely open to like Bigfoot in the Northwest and in very forested areas, but it's like Florida and the Everglades, it's a little harder to believe. But by the end of that shoot and certain people that I interviewed who were just convinced, I was like, you know what? Who am I to say this thing, or this thing maybe even once, existed out here. But there were people in that doc who'd been in the Everglades for 70 years, who are trackers and didn't really have anything to gain from it and never publicized their belief, that said they had these experiences that it changed my mind, at least, like still skeptical, but more open to that possibility for sure.
Yeah, I think when I've spoken to people academically or on this show or at conventions or wherever, I tend to try to look at it phenomenologically or experientially. Like I've spoken to so many people that I don't think are lying to me and I don't think are crazy. And I think they've had some kind of experience, but what that experience is, the skeptic in me is always resistant to accept that the manifestation that they saw was what the phenomenon actually was. Like in your wonderful movie, for example, Love and Saucers with David Huggins, which I'll get you, maybe I'll just get you to pitch that to the audience if they haven't heard it as well before I talk any more about that.
Yeah, sure. So that feature documentary is about this man. He's almost 80 now, living in Hoboken, New Jersey, he claims that he lost his virginity to an extraterrestrial woman when he was 17. And that's just one of hundreds of encounters that he had dating back to when he was 9. And he chronicled all of it in these kind of amazing surreal oil paintings, because he had a little bit of training, but he's mostly what would be considered like an outsider or folk artist. And no one had seen these paintings, or very few people had. There was like a little book that was put out by a smaller imprint. But other than that, like no web presence, not really any shows. And they'd just been collecting dust, 150 paintings, mind-blowing paintings in his studio until I got there and started filming.
It's a wonderful film. And what I find fascinating when I listen to people like David, I don't think that he's lying and I don't think he's insane, but I often wonder what would happen if you could be a fly on the wall, if you could go back to one of the times he believes he had an experience. Would you see what he saw, or would nothing have happened at all? Or would you see him like in a strange fugue state? Or would there be a weird light in the room rather than beings? Like what is the phenomenon that triggered those experiences? And that's something, that's an aside, but it's something which I'm always conscious of when I hear somebody tell me a story and I don't think they're lying. But I always wonder, what was it?
That's the thing. I believe him too, in the sense that I believe that he had experiences and he saw them this way. I'm not convinced that if I were there in the room with him, that I would be seeing the same things as him, especially if, there's this school of belief now with the UFO phenomenon that it's tied to our consciousness and it's not just a nuts and bolts materialist thing. And so he might be experiencing something that is very real that I'm not experiencing. He mentioned his brother and sister, they remembered him running away from things when he was a kid that they didn't see. And reacting to things that they didn't see. So I'm more on the sort of in the school of thought of Kripal, Jeffrey Kripal, who is in the doc. He's a professor of comparative religious studies at Rice University. That these things are akin to mystical experiences that in one point in history they were called religious experiences, and now because of our technological age and space going age, that they are screened as extraterrestrial UFO experiences, but they're just as profound experiences regardless of what they are. But what they actually really are, that we may never be able to know. It might be an unknowable thing.
Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile way of looking at it, and I think it's
Yeah.
also quite insightful. What I found as somebody who's spent a lot of time looking at the history of UFO belief in that documentary, which I found fascinating, was it's referenced in there. It's even, I think, on screen on one of his paintings that he started to remember these things in 1987. I think the date's August 18 or something. I can't remember, but I think it's a date in August is when he started to remember these things. And then he told his wife, and of course, there's that. It's almost like, coming out. It's a very strange thing to tell somebody. I remembered I was an alien abductee when I was a boy, to tell your wife. But in 1987, of course, and this is where the cultural historian in me starts to always pull apart these narratives. Not that I don't think anybody's lying to me, but I see these cultural influences. Whitley Strieber's Communion was published in February of that year. By August, it had been in the New York Times bestseller list for multiple weeks. I think it spent over 30 weeks in the New York Times bestseller list, including hitting #1. So that poster, I remember at the time, that Communion poster with those big black eyes, which features so prominently in all of David's artwork, that was everywhere. Even in Sydney, it was everywhere. So I can only imagine what it was like in the United States of America. That book was heavily promoted. So I always find it interesting, not just David, but so many abductees who come out later and remember stories from the 50s or the 60s with these communion-like beings, or these X-Files now type-like beings with the gray bodies and the big black eyes. They only remember it really post the cultural trope becoming so prominent. So that it almost is like it infects that narrative. It's almost like it's very difficult then to decide those things that you're conscious of when you go in as a documentarian. Like, how do you divide these things?
Yeah, and then also, going on at that time or being released was Bud Hopkins' Intruder's book, which, the stories are so similar to what David and other abductees are describing. And there's even a point in the film where David's reading the book and he says, I just remembered something. I was in my bed and I was floating above bed. And I'm like, why did you just remember that, David? And he says, because I just read it here in the book.
Right.
And so it's, the skeptic will say, well, they're just grafting these things that they're reading onto themselves. But then the believer would say, no, it's because multiple people are having the same experiences. And then there is room to kind of float in between there, where you can say that there are, sci-fi movies and books like this because people have had the experiences, but that at the same time, people are having these experiences because of the books. And it's sort of like a circle or a feedback loop that's feeding in on itself.
Oh, I totally agree. I think science fiction and UFO belief has fed off at each other so promptly. I myself have a similar story to what's kind of presented there, with David having these memories after having read a book. When I first became interested again in alien abduction and things like that, I was interested in UFOs and monsters and Bigfoot as a kid. I mean, I was a kid of the 70s, so it was all In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, and every house even in Australia always had a copy of an Eric von Daniken book on the bookshelf. Like it was the 70s. There was new age weird stuff everywhere, right? But certainly, when I was a child, well, I'll tell it the other way around. I'll tell you what happened first. I was reading Edith Fiore's book, which I think is called Encounters or something. She was a psycho or a psychologist who did hypnotic regression and specialized in alien abduction. And it was the first one I read. I read it before I read Hopkins. I read it before I read Mack or even Strieber or any of these people who were working in that field. And when I was reading that book, I was like taken back to memories I had as a child of a rather disturbing dream, which I don't think I'd ever forgotten, but it hadn't been something which had traveled with me throughout my life. Obviously, it was still there because I remembered it. And when I was a little boy, I had this dream of this little man. He was more, I don't know, almost like dwarfish, or maybe like a creature out, or maybe like one of the characters out of Wizard of Oz, but more stocky, one of the Munchkins. Do you know what I mean? He didn't look like a grey alien, just to contextualize it, but he was a diminutive being who would visit me at night and take me away every night to this place where there were all these tall figures, much taller than he was and I was. He was about my height. And I remember the one very clear dream recollection I have is of tugging on one of their legs, the tall beings, because I thought it was my mother, and this thing bending down with its face inches from mine. And it was completely inhuman. Like it was, I don't even want to try to describe it because I've seen so much science fiction since. I don't want to transpose what I've seen since onto it. But it wasn't like you or I or anybody I've ever had on this show or ever met. It wasn't something that was us. And those occurrences, or the dream, continued until one night the little man came, and I knew as a boy, if I went with him, I just knew if I go with him tonight, I'm never ever coming back. And I have this very clear dream memory of physically wrestling the little boy, the little dwarf, or the little man, or the midget, or goblin, or ET, or whatever we want to call him, wrestling him physically on my bed. And it's ontologically as real in my memory as wrestling boys in the playground at the same time in my life. Now, do I really think I was being taken away by something? No, I think my childhood subconscious was working something out, but who the devil really knows? But my point is, having had that experience when I started to read these abduction books, which became very prevalent in the late 80s into the 90s, you instantly start to go, I know, when I read this in my 20s, and I'm like, maybe I was an alien abductee. I wonder what would have happened if I had let myself travel with that idea and or gone to a hypnotherapist and been guided by them into discovering these memories. So my point is, I wonder how many people like David, or alternatively even like myself, might have been transformed into abductees because of this cultural awareness of what was going on in these books and other other mediums.
Just, who you are as a person, what your personality is like, your upbringing, your level of skepticism. You could have been, the next David Huggins if you had a different sort of maybe outlook on life or way of thinking of things. Like you I think very easily could have interpreted those as not dreams and as reality, right? Because they sound so classic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't think David recovered any of his via hypnosis, though. I think he just remembered his. Is that correct?
Yeah, I tried to get him to do hypnotherapy or hypnotic regression for the doc, and I had to reach out to like 30 hypnotherapists in New York, and they were like, hell no. I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. Mostly because they didn't want to do something with someone who wasn't actually like a patient of theirs. And they're like, this guy could have like a psychotic break while we're doing hypnotherapy. So I finally found one guy who said yes. I don't know how ethical he was, but he said yes. And then at the last minute, David said no. And that he didn't actually, he remembered everything just fine. And he didn't need to go through hypnosis.
Huh. That's interesting.
For a good, documentary scene, but not necessarily good for David.
Yeah, a lot of so many. That's why one of the reasons your film in David's case is so interesting. That this is something that he remembered without the assistance of hypnosis, because so many of the narratives are recalled, as you know, under hypnosis. And when I was doing my research on UFO belief, and I spoke to a number of abductees, I spoke to one woman who'd worked with one of the most famous, I don't want to say anything bad about the man because he's passed, but I mean, it wouldn't be very hard to realize who he was. He was one of the big ones, right? And she'd worked with him extensively. And I believe when I was talking to this woman, I don't think she was lying to me. I don't think she was nuts. I think she'd had some genuine kind of experience at the base of it. But what she told me was super telling, and it was, when I was working with such and such and being hypnotized, I couldn't remember, and I still can't, what the entities look like. I know something happened to me. I know something was there. I went through these strange experiences, and she related a number of them to me, but I just couldn't for the life of me. And the famous alien abduction hypno-regressionist, she said he just pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and I finally told him what I knew he wanted to hear. Little gray man with, big heads and almond-shaped black eyes, and then he was happy. And that's so and you've got to wonder if that's just one, how many of these stories are based on that kind of, contamination. I think you're muted, Brad.
Sorry, I was going to
Sorry,
say.
I do the same thing many times.
Yeah, I was going to say I think a lot are contaminated. Just hypnotherapy in general, it's contentious if it should ever be used as any kind of evidence, So, and we're very subjective beings just in our nature. So I think you can definitely get valuable insight from it, but that it shouldn't be taken as some incorruptible memory.
Mm-hmm. As you can see, I could go down this route forever, but let's shift gear. Let's shift gears a little bit. What got you interested in these type of materials being the topics for what you examine in your films?
Yeah, I think it's, even though I've always been what would be called a skeptic, but I'm not a critic, and just skeptical. I still want to believe, and so as a kid, I wanted there to be magic in the world. My dad doesn't do this anymore, but like a biotechnologist, a biologist, and very science-based, atheist, which was largely my upbringing. And there was something in me that wanted to believe that there was something more that was unexplainable, that was hidden, paranormal, unknown. And so I was actively sort of searching for it, but never fully ever able to kind of give myself over to believing that any one thing was true or real. And at the same time, I'm equally fascinated by the psychology of belief and, our consciousness. And so melding those two together is this idea of telling people stories that have had these experiences. And so there's that little kid in me that gets satisfied. That's like, maybe I'm going to learn something or show something that is really truly like magical. But then there's also this probing of the human mind and consciousness and psychology that gets me.
And you look at that. What is the impact of actually the person's thought process, or the damage perhaps to the thought process in another one of your recent wonderful documentaries, which is Do You See What I See? Can we talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So this is a story about, basically he's kind of known, or he was known as the artist of conspiracy culture. And I feel like a lot of people, if you spend any time online, you've seen some of his works before, but probably had no idea who is this person that's making there's sort of these funhouse conspiracy collages that are like funny and grotesque and confusing, but sometimes poignant. And they were all made by this one guy who used to be an artist for Sesame Street. And who became sort of radicalized in a way by 9/11, at the same time as being poisoned by his paints that he was using, because he was spraying acrylic without a mask.
Gosh.
Which gives you heavy metal poisoning, which causes neurological issues, which he had, and which also could be linked to some paranoid delusional thinking. And he went hard into this, into conspiracy theorizing, and he became a sort of a guru of conspiracy culture. And I was fascinated about this guy and wanted to, I made a short film about a narrative about conspiracy theorists. And I'm like, what about real conspiracy theorists, and the people who believe in these things? And, I've believed in some that turn out to be true. There's definitely a lot that have turned out to be true.
Absolutely.
And so I visited him and was totally sort of disarmed by, he's kind of like a charming, nice person who just happens to have most of his beliefs I like vehemently disagree with, and some are pretty ugly, but we're still able to connect and create a dialogue, which was, my hope for making all of these films is to not judge people outright and demonize them. And he died just a couple months after filming, while I was editing the project. And like you were asking earlier, would some people, some of my subjects, like actively maybe dislike one of my pieces? Maybe he would have. It's hard to know. But I think I have people from both sides of the aisle on that one liking it. there's people that kind of believe in his work and support him, that think it's a good portrait, and people who think conspiracy theorists are the most nut job people out there who like the doc.
Yeah, I thought it was fairly fair. I mean, I'm like you. I think there are some conspiracy theories that I think are just whacked, but there are some that have, as you've mentioned, have turned out to be true. There's also some that have turned out to be totally bogus, including, and this is probably unpopular to say, big ones pushed by the mainstream media. The Russia collusion hoax was nonsense, and it's all we saw for years in the news cycle. So it can go both ways. I think people can tend to think conspiratorially sometimes, and I think often the right is blamed for conspiracist thinking, but I think it comes out just as often from the other side of politics as well. And because we live in this world where, it's hard to trust establishments and corporations and governments because there's this history of malfeasance. So there's an attraction to that type of thinking,
Yeah, and interestingly, I think conspiracy theories originally, at least in America, were more of from the left-wing side of things, because like the whole anti-vax came from the left originally for the most part, and the New Age and hippie movements and UFOs, I think, were largely from coming from that as well. And we've seen, it seems like a shift rightward with these, especially with QAnon and all the political stuff now. But I do think that there's at its base like pretty equal representation, that everyone is prone to this sort of thing.
And I think things get mixed up. I think QAnon's biggest problem was clearly nonsense. But to me, people would go, these QAnon people, they don't trust this and that. I'm like, I don't trust this or that either. But what the QAnon problem was this idea that there was this, great secret push to save, there were these good guys coming to the rescue and saving everything and just follow the plan. It was just obviously such nonsense.
There's no good guys.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There aren't, and that's it's hard to. And I think everybody wants to think they're on the right side of history and they're on the good camp, but it's difficult to see the good camp anymore. That's the hard part. So I can see. That's why all of these things are attractive. And and I consider myself probably. I'm a libertarian, probably / conservative on the right. That's probably my politics. But I have very good friends because I'm in the arts and academia who are on the left, and I have various people of different degrees on the left. And I was surprised, and I'm still surprised by how some of my friends on the left still maintain a very suspicious to the corporate narrative line. They really do. They doubt everything out of as they always have, and rightfully perhaps so, because I'm suspicious of corporations too. But at the same time, there are now many people on the left who will think Bill Gates is the good guy, and it's very strange to see people now accepting corporate mouthpieces or corporate media. Like, I don't trust any corporate media. I don't care what it is. I think there's always some talking points, whether it's Jeff Zucker or Roger Ailes, there's somebody leading the corporate talking points on either side of the aisle. But there are people who on the left, who I thought would have been more suspicious, will now just accept mainstream talking points. And I'm like, hey, you were really suspicious of this stuff 20 years ago. What on earth happened to you?
And similar how, Alex Jones used to be, Alex Jones used to be, he was anti-Bush, he was anti-Republican and anti-Democrat and suspicious of everything. And then there was a pretty big shift with him too, becoming more, he was part of the establishment eventually, the Trump presidency
was the Jones presidency. And I'll be, it's not something, I don't normally talk politics on this show, but I like Alex Jones. I liked him. I've liked him for probably, 15 years. So it's interesting to see these shifts though, and you're right. There is Alex Jones. I had left-leaning friends who used to love Alex Jones because he was, all about 9/11 being, an inside job and all anti-Bush. But the second that his position seemed, I just think he's always the contrarian. You know what I mean? So it seemed, but you're right. There was a period where he definitely seemed part of the Trump establishment and that kind of order. But it's such strange days. It's hard to place anybody politically anymore.
Yeah,
that must be weird for you as a documentarian going into these areas and trying to determine who sits where and why. And
well, it used to not be something to care about even, like this stuff wasn't a matter of politics before the last, whatever, I don't know how many years, maybe it's been like 10 years or so. I feel like it actually started happening around the Obama presidency, where things started getting more polarized. And now everything is a political thing. And it's actually just kind of sad and defeatist because people dig in and we can't talk to people anymore. And so I want to get as far away from that as I can. And I think everyone's so fatigued by it.
Oh,
too,
absolutely.
And there are enough, like Vice and HBO and everyone who's coming out with docs about all this stuff. I don't need to put the time
it's fine. Well, I don't know how we slid into politics, but we did. Speaking about docs and current affairs and where you should and shouldn't go, have you ever thought about doing like anything on UFO disclosure, or what's your kind of position on the post Tic Tac video rollout stuff that's been so prominent since 2017?
We'll talk about distrust in the government and corporations. It's just I have so much skepticism about anything that the military is disclosing at any point, that it's not going to be, it's going to be self-serving. And I love Jacques Vallée, and I know that he's in on this somehow. And I actually would trust his position on things. And Bigelow's such an interesting character. I really like, he's so mysterious. Like I would love to spend some time with Bigelow. But yeah, I'm just stepping back from all that just because of who's involved with, it's the military, it's the government, it's aerospace industry. And so I can't get too excited about any of that stuff. And also there's people in that sphere, like, Jeremy Corbell. I don't know if you ever had worked with
I haven't had him on the show, but I know who he is.
Yeah. And so he's got this whole world covered. Like I think he's the most tapped in filmmaker, and it wouldn't really make sense for me unless I was doing some kind of meta analysis of it all. But I want to believe, obviously, like I said, and be so cool. But I'm not gonna any disclosure coming from the Pentagon is.
You and I are exactly the same. I've always said I don't think disclosure's coming, but the day it comes, I'm going to think I'm being lied to.
Yeah, right. Like, it's sad. It's sad that it's come to that. But
I'm a massive fan of Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée's been a major influence on my thinking, and is in my PhD dissertation is one of the major turning points. After Condon, where he comes out with Passport to Magonian and throws science overboard, it's actually in my dissertation as one of those key turning points in the history of UFO belief. But have you read his new book, Trinity, the Biggest Secret?
No, I haven't.
I only just got it the other day. I wanted the hardcover because I like to have hard covers by Vallée. So I don't know why there was a back order. It took a long time to get here. I finally got it. And I started to read it, and I've heard him interviewed on Coast to Coast. And I'm only just through the foreword or his introduction, and now I'm into the juice of the book itself. But that seems to me the same way the disclosure that wasn't when we thought we were going to get disclosure, and it really wasn't when the DoD dropped their study or whatever it was, and people seemed overexcited and underexcited. But there was something to me as a UFO historian that was fascinating with that. There was a sea change in it. The US government had decided not to take UFO reports as a potential threat to national security or aviation security seriously since the Condon Committee's report back in 1969, which is that same turning point which kind of spawned Jacques Vallée's mode of thinking. So there was a change when the recent Department of Defense report once again said maybe there's something here and we should be looking at it, because that hadn't been the case officially, at least, since the late 1960s. But Jacques Vallée's thinking, there's been, I think, I haven't finished the book, but I think there's been an equivalent sea change. It starts with, obviously, it's about a supposed UFO crash in 1945. Anybody who's familiar with Vallée's thinking knows that, and I think rightfully so, poo-pooed Roswell and poo-pooed other crashes, because, I agree with him. I don't think there was anything extraterrestrial that crashed there, although I'm sympathetic to Nick Redfern's books about perhaps it was, some secret government project and there were malformed, humans who were tested on. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm more sympathetic to that. But in the forward to the new book, Philet's like, I've been criticized for not taking Roswell seriously, and maybe I should have rightfully been criticized, and I should have. And I'm like, what on earth? Because those formative books of yours were always, this isn't physical. This is something, we're seeing something like in a projection, in a cinema, it's projected on the screen in front of us. The real technology isn't what we're seeing. It's not the saucer, it's behind us. In Revelations, he says there's this, it's almost like this fallacy you can fall into, just wanting to go down the physical route. So you want to accept the saucer crashes, you want to accept the stories of underground bases, all this physical stuff's very tempting to accept, but it's all nonsense. But the new book, it literally starts out with Philet saying I was wrong, which is, to me, it's shocking as somebody who's a psychosocial kind of theorist as well. So anyway, I haven't read it all yet. We should both read it and talk about it once we both read the book.
I'm down. So Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University, they're about to open what's called the Archives of the Impossible. And it's basically a vast paranormal library at the university, largest of its kind, where people are donating their personal archives. So Whitley Strieber is one of the donors. And so far 10 people have, and another one is Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée is giving over his entire archive of correspondences, emails, notes, writings, photos. But the trick with his, separate from the other 9 people, which are sort of immediately viewable to the public, is there's a 10-year moratorium on Jacques stuff. So no one can read, even staff, no one can read his notes for 10 years.
Good grief.
And I'm like, what's going on with that? Yeah, I mean, apparently it's because, there are a lot of people who are in these archives who are mentioned that don't necessarily want to be publicly known as being involved with this stuff, and that in 10 years' time, perhaps there won't be so many of them alive or working in their jobs. So, but it could also be that there's some juicy stuff in there that we can't handle yet for 10 years.
Wow. I did not know. 10 years time, I'm going to be walking in this and I want to look at this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Jeez. But speaking of Whitley Strieber, we have, and this will be the wonderful thing if you come to the festival, MidWest WeirdFest at Micon Cinemas, March 4 to 6 in downtown Eau Claire. We have the world premiere of a new feature documentary called Alien Abduction Answers, and it features Whitley Strieber. Like, he's really the front and center of that documentary. So
that's cool. Who made that one?
It's great to see Whitley on screen. I mean, I've once again, it isn't that I think Whitley's lying to me. It's that I always take this stuff with how much is true and how much isn't. And one of the things I've always found fascinating about Whitley is it's either in Transformation or Breakthrough. It's in one of the books he wrote after communion. I should know because I quoted it in my dissertation again. Is he talked about how what was happening to him seemed to be so predictable and mundane, or so, that mightn't have been the words he used, but just not interesting, the abduction phenomenon. And he said, I thought it should have been better than this. So I kind of let my imagination broaden, and I thought, I think there's something really there. And at times when you listen to Whitley, there are times where he seems uncertain, or certainly over the history of, the 30, 40 years it's been since Communion's come out. There are times where he seems uncertain of what it is, and he seems open to various interpretations, and then it seems like he's leading towards perhaps one interpretation in one of his novels or one of his books. So I like that. I like the ability for people to one of the reasons I love Philip K. Dick, the great science fiction writer, is in his semi-autobiographical books like Valors. He's clearly unsure. Was the messages I were receiving some Gnostic Christian message, or was it three-eyed beings from Sirius, or was it the KGB? I like that. I'm not sure what it is, because anybody who comes down and says, I know what it is, that becomes problematic, I think.
Yeah, and Whitley's kind of a special case because not only did he have these experiences or claim to have these experiences, but he's such a good writer and communicator and artist. And most of these people, they're not known for that. They weren't writers before this happened to them. Like David Huggins, he's a great artist, but he's not a great speaker. He doesn't write. It's very hard to get answers out of him. He doesn't think about what happened to him. But Whitley, it's like, he's like hyper intelligent and has such a way with words, and really special case.
Oh, he's a fantastic communicator. I used to be a big fan of, before podcasts were as big a thing, back when after he'd done, I think he used to do the weekend Coast to Coast, which was called Dreamland, but then he had his own podcast on Unknown Country, his website, which I think was also called Dreamland, back in maybe the late 90s into the 2000s. I used to download and listen to that religiously. And because Strieber is such a wonderful wordsmith, and he speaks so, it was something to listen to before I go to bed at night because it was so soothing, even though sometimes the stories were scary or whatever else. But Strieber can just spin a tale, and he speaks, he has this tone about him, this calmness. So yeah, I agree. He'd be another great subject. You know what? If you could do a Valet documentary, get Strieber in there as well.
I'd contacted Valet for Love and Saucers to see if he'd talk about the phenomenon at the time he was stepping away. He had a period where he stepped away from UFO related stuff and swore that he wouldn't get back to it. And now he's back. But yeah, I would hopefully, I would love to just meet him. That would be enough.
Oh, me too.
For me. Yeah. Before I forget, when you were with the Unarius group back in 1999 or something, were they releasing the doves from the UFO?
Yeah, they were still doing the doves. They still had they do the big march where they'd have like the Cadillac with the saucer on top, and there'd be the girls in the Jetson type uniforms with the horns, and the doves would come out. Oh, it was quite a sight. What interested me there is that was the last, just before Charles Spiegel died, he was the last kind of, I guess, cult leader. I'm resistant to use the word cult, but the last real leader of the group, because I think after that it became a council orientated thing. I don't think there was one charismatic person. So he followed on from Ruth, who'd followed on from her husband, Ernest, but most of the glory days were under Ruth, and then Charles Spiegel was the next one. But I think I was the last outsider and I spent a bit of time with him. Anyway, I ended up writing a piece for 40 Times because I was the last person who'd kind of been with him.
Oh, cool.
But that said, what was interesting was when he channeled, because he was channeling the Space Brothers or the intelligence or whatever it was. You see a lot of channelers who do all of this kind of and their heads are rolling around and they're talking in strange voices. He just sat on the stage in the tent out there as the desert wind whistled outside, and he just spoke in his own voice, occasionally pausing extensively like he was waiting for the transmission. But there was nothing. It seemed very... normal's the wrong word. It seemed very mundane. Do you know what I mean? There wasn't anything really weird happening. I mean, sure, there was the pageantry, but there wasn't anything which seemed much different it reminded me, I used to date in my late teens, early 20s, a girl who was involved in amateur musical societies. So they were always having like clean up the studio on the weekends, or a barbecue for fundraising. Unarius felt like that. It felt like these people who came together. Like I can't even remember when I was at their actual headquarters, they were like, well, next weekend we're going to all come in here and clean out the back. Who's going to do? And it just felt like, it feels like an amateur musical society. And they used to like to get dressed up, and it was pomp and circumstance. They thought, these are people who just like the companionship and the raiments of the whole thing.
They seem refreshingly harmless.
Absolutely.
A friend of mine is doing a feature-length documentary.
Oh, wow.
About them. Yeah, I'm very jealous that she gets to do that. But the I don't know if you had read, but the UFO on the Cadillac, once they were like driving it on the highway, and the UFO, which weighs like probably like 100+ pounds or a few hundred pounds, it dislodged from the Cadillac and went careening across like 6 lanes of highway and caused some damage. And so they were like ordered by the city of like El Cajon to like, they had to ground the Cadillac, and they weren't allowed to drive it anywhere.
Gosh, I did not hear that story. That's fantastic.
In the parking lot now. You can still see it in the parking lot.
I'll tell you a quick funny story about the Cadillac, though. And when you drove out to the Conclave of Light, they all met at the Unarius headquarters, and then you travel behind, the Cadillac or whatever. I think it was the Cadillac. It was at the front, but Charles Spiegel at the time, and this was shortly before his death, he was an old man, was in the front car driving, leading the procession. And there were all these people. I was with one of the main women behind, so I could interview her on the way, which was fun. And, but we were following the car. And for some reason, Charles accidentally turned into like a mall strip, like where there was a Burger King or something else. So the whole procession accidentally made that turn with him. And we're all winding around this car park of a strip mall, and the woman's like, what's going on? And it was obvious that poor Charles in his dotage had just made a wrong turn. So yeah, that was pretty funny times. But so what would be your dream documentary if you could do one? You mentioned Valet, but other than Valet, what else pops out at you as something you'd love to do?
I would like to do what Bigelow has always been into, I guess, but what's become more public, and Kreipel is involved in this too, is his consciousness research and studies. So he's really interested in life after death, or does consciousness survive death, and in what form? What is the nature of consciousness? And I think just a film on that subject and his sort of obsession about it, I would love to do that, because that's something I'm really interested in, just as an aside, but as a story to tell, near-death experiences and life after death and all of that. It'd be a big story to tackle. And Bigelow is famous for, being media shy. But that would be kind of a dream project, and also something, or maybe it could be a part of it, but I love the world of remote viewing and that sort of psi exploration, telekinesis and telepathy and all of that. Love to do something on that subject too.
Is Ed Dames still kicking around? I think
I think so.
He might be.
Yeah.
Gee, an Ed Dames doco would be great.
Well, even Puthoff and Targ, they're still alive. They're in their 90s. They're still alive. One of them is here in Austin.
Huh.
I think Puthoff is here in Austin, and his, he has a whole institute that remote views for like businesses. I think down here.
What? Maybe I need to hire him for MidWest WeirdFest.
Yeah. You could.
I don't know for what reason, but it'd be fun just to hire him. And also, if you were doing a near-death experience, I was only recommending this to another filmmaker the other day, who I think he's writing a book on it at the moment. But he's also a filmmaker. Have you read any of the Kenneth Ring stuff, like the Amiga Project? Or Kenneth Ring, I think, used to be the near-death experience guy, and I think he was on Art Bell back in the day, and he's a doctor, like a PhD doctor, I think, and I think he co-founded the Near-Death Experience Institute. It has some name like that anyway, but he wrote a number of books. I think Approaching Amiga was one of them, and the only one I ever read was the Amiga Project, I think. In fact, it's on my shelf over there somewhere. I should go and pull it off. But it compared near-death experiences to the alien abduction phenomenon and other things. So I think a near-death experience. Anyway, if you do that doco, look up Kenneth Ring and read some. Maybe he's still alive. I think he's probably in his 90s or 80s now too. He's certainly not a young man anymore, but he's still out there.
This whole old guard is they're approaching probably their last days soon.
Yeah, they're all approaching Amiga now, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, we've lost it. Even from the time I was doing my research, like I talked to Bud Hopkins. I spent time personally with him, John Keel, Jim Moseley, like all of those guys now. And I mean, Moseley and Keel really were the older guard. They were people who'd been fiddling. These are particularly Moseley. He'd been somebody whose interest probably went back to the 50s. So to lose those people, and I don't know if it's just me, but I find that earlier period so much more interesting. Like I find those characters so much more interesting. In fact, there's a Saucer Smear at the beginning of Love and Saucers. You see a cover of a Saucer Smear newsletter, Jim Moseley's newsletter. And I was like, Saucer Smear, I used to subscribe to that.
Yeah, someone I know who collects David Huggins's work, he inherited all of David's Saucer Smear issues, so he's got big, like just years and years and years of them, just boxes of Saucer Smear now.
Gosh, Mosley Mosley would have been such a perfect subject for a documentary from you. I mean, I only spent probably 2 or 3 hours with him in Clearwater. We got drunk together at a bar. It was a lot of fun. It was one of my fondest memories of all of my time in UFO research. I spent time with John Keel at a bar as well, but he'd stopped drinking by then, so he was just drinking Diet Cokes while I was probably getting drunk. But but yeah, those guys, it was a different, I'm not saying anything bad about UFO researchers today, but there was a character to those people. There was something which was above and beyond just an interest in the field. Like they were larger than life personalities when you can tell it when they're writings. Forget about meeting them. You can just tell it when you read anything those men wrote. Gray Barker would have been somebody else who would have been spectacular to meet. I never met Barker. Mm-hmm. But man, it's been so much fun chatting to you. I sure hope you can make MidWest WeirdFest, because it's been.
I'd love to, yeah.
Is there anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about at all tonight, Brad?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I mentioned the folklore project, and I'm working on a feature-length doc about conspiracy theorists and doing these intimate portraits with them, similar to David Dees, and just a couple other little projects in the pipeline. But a documentary about cryptozoologists, the people that study the.
Oh, wow. Cryptids. Can you give us any of the names of some of the people in either of those? Or
yeah, I mean, sadly, like one of them died, Scott Martis. He was the CHAMP researcher.
I know.
Yeah, Lauren Coleman, we've already interviewed. We'd like to interview again. He had a stroke recently, or in the last couple of years, sadly. Okay. Lyle Blackburn, of course.
He's a great guy.
Yeah. Linda Godfrey. And we will be going to Australia for Tasmanian tiger.
Oh, wow.
Research, and Yowie, maybe a little bit of Yowie. Mongolian deathworm with Richard Freeman will do.
Gosh.
Adam Davies in Indonesia for the orang pendek. Yeah.
Man, I can't. You got to keep me posted for the films as well for MidWest WeirdFest as the years roll by. So, do you have a URL or a website somewhere people can check what you're up to?
I'm just bradabrahams.net, my name, and then on Instagram I'm Brad WTF, and then on Twitter I'm Love and Saucers, and that's my web presence there.
Where would you point people at if they wanted to watch, say, Love and Saucers? What would be the best site for them to go to watch that film?
Now it's on Discovery Plus, which is Discovery Channel streaming service, but you can rent it through Amazon. Amazon's probably the best place, but it's also on iTunes and Google Play and YouTube and Tubi even, so you can watch it for free just with some ads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it was an incredible joy to finally get to talk to you. And I'm delighted to have a film of yours at MidWest WeirdFest this year. And until we chat again, which hopefully will be soon, Brad, keep it weird.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.